Dorie, I could not think of a better person to kick off this new platform because you are somebody who has worked in politics. You advise some of the biggest emerging leaders in Silicon Valley, and you have a pulse on what people are feeling. So I'm really, really happy that you agreed to join.
I appreciate it, Hope. Thanks for having me.
I think the biggest question for many of us is, what is the best way to stay grounded during times of uncertainty, especially when you feel like your job might be at risk?
The really short answer is hoard money and diversify. But besides that, I think that this is a time that's stressful. I mean, tech in particular has, for the past 2 decades at least, been the bulwark against all economic recessions. Whatever was happening in the outside world, you need coders, you need engineers. Tech was this impenetrable fortress of job security. And we saw starting first a couple of years ago with the mass round of layoffs in different tech companies. And now, as we're getting reports that by the end of the year, a really large percentage of code is estimated to be written by AI, humans are becoming a little bit more dispensable. And so that is creating a lot of economic uncertainty in Silicon Valley and beyond.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the confluence of the distractions and the economic pressures. And we joked about hoarding money, but I mean, that is real, true advice. Because there is now this confluence of the AI pressures and the political uncertainty, which of these do you tackle first as a worker?
So I think we have to go back to first principles here. We have to go back to the serenity prayer and basically figure out, what can I control? What can I not control? And focus on the former. And so geopolitics, technological advances, unless you literally are an employee at OpenAI or whatnot, you don't have your finger on that. You're not controlling that. So we have to go back to, what can I actually do in this moment? And this is something that I and others for a decade plus have been beating the drum on, but I believe it has become even more urgent and even more critical. And that is the importance of networking and relationship building. And it's about building a strong personal brand. And the reason those things are so important, number one, you need a strong network, a fresh network. It's not helpful if you know a lot of people, but you haven't talked to them for 10 years. You need to reach out. You need to be in touch so that you're top of mind. Because if your company has a disruption and has big layoffs, if your industry, whatever that industry in, has a contraction, you need people that you can call who know you're good, know you're available, and are willing to help you. And with regard to the personal brand, that ties in because what are you known for? What are you good at? If they want, if you're a nice guy, they want to help you, but it's a lot easier to help you if they say, well, he's a nice guy that can do X, Y, and Z, or she's a nice gal who can do A, B, and C.
Is it too late though? I mean, if you haven't talked to that person in 10 years, I know you probably get this in your inbox all the time. It feels a little out of the blue. It feels forced. It's kind of obvious what they're trying to do.
So I agree. It's offensive. When you haven't talked to somebody for a long time and they come at you with an ask, oh, hey, Hope, do you have a job for me? I mean, that doesn't feel good. You don't want to be used. But it's also true. There actually has been really interesting research that's been done where on one side of the equation, you have people who are presented with the idea of, oh, what about reaching out to a long lost contact? And they all say, oh, they'd think it was so weird that, they would be grossed out. They wouldn't want to talk to me. And meanwhile, they then ask the person, well, what if someone you hadn't talked to for 10 years, assuming you had a nice relationship with them before, but you just hadn't talked to them for a long time. What if they reached out to you? And almost everybody said, oh, that would be great. I'd love to hear from them. That would be awesome. So I think that we often overestimate the problem. As long as you're not coming at someone with some obnoxious ask right away, if you're just reconnecting and reinitiating the relationship, maybe you go on the person's LinkedIn profile and you see what they've been doing and you say, oh, hey, I didn't know that this had happened or that you were working at this place now. I was thinking of you and just wanted to say hi. Starting up that connection now is really powerful. There was a great book from the 80s by Harvey Mackay called Dig Your Well Before You're Thirsty. And I think that's a principle we all need to start living by.
I mean, in this very on-demand world, I think what you're referring to really is just tact, right? And just, kindness, consideration. But there's desperation in the air. People are really anxious. And so I think that's a really, really good reminder. All right. So we've talked kind of about the what do you do sort of outside your day to day when you're signed offline. Now, if you are a worker and you're worried about your job, what should the worker be focused on in the day to day operations of the company that they're working for?
Yeah. So this is a challenge. I mean, as we're doing this interview, 3 days ago, I got an email from a longtime friend of mine who works in Silicon Valley. Her headline was, "The thing we expected to happen has happened," and she had just gotten her layoff notice. So this is a real thing that is going on and is affecting people. Ultimately, for these things, a question we need to ask ourselves as much as is possible is, what can we do to make ourselves indispensable in that organization? How do you make sure that, if there are cuts that need to be made, that people look at your name on the list and say, well, not her. We can't afford to lose her. And so what does that look like? There's really interesting research by, in particular, Ronald Burt out of the University of Chicago, who wrote about the concept of how people can make themselves indispensable within an organization. And what he discovered is that the people who are considered most valuable, most indispensable, were the ones who actually performed a really specific function in the organization. And that is, they were, I guess you could say, connectors, but it means something a little bit more important. What he discovered is that I think we know this intuitively, every organization has silos, and it's, departments that don't talk to each other, or divisions or field offices. And the person who is able to bridge those gaps and communicate information between them, those were the people who were considered by their colleagues and their bosses to be the most valuable, because they essentially prevented people from reinventing the wheel. And people saw that and they recognized it. These are folks who didn't hoard information. They shared it generously. And by doing it, everyone recognized, you are making the company work better.
That's fascinating, because I would think that it's like a specific skill.
For humans, again, the question is, what's the value of a human? What's the place that we can lean in? And ultimately, it's about relationships. It's about talking with people, making connections, and having people like you. These sound like very basic things, but that is what enables someone to be successful in an organization as a human, rather than, having if we're going head to head against technology very soon, if not now, AI is going to know more than you ever can know and do it faster than you ever can do. And so we have to find other ways of adding value to the process.
And it's really actually the same advice that you were giving just a minute ago about what you're doing outside of your job, which build the relationships, which that parallel is not a coincidence. Now, it's funny also that you said a couple of times that the company can't afford to lose you, because we do know that some people get cut because their salaries are too high. If you're in that position, I mean, I don't know if people are aware of this. I mean, you work with a lot of clients who may be in that really tricky middle manager layer or just below. What do you do if you're in that position?
Ultimately, the question that any company is going to be asking is, am I getting more value out of this person than I'm putting in? If your salary is $200,000 a year and you are bringing the company $200,000 worth of value, they look at that and say, why am I bothering? There's the structural overhead, that's not helpful. But if you are bringing 500,000 or $1 million or more worth of value to your company, then you are a bargain that they will take any day of the week, no matter what kind of financial peril they find themselves in. Unless they are literally bankrupt and have zero, they are always going to want to turn $1 into $5 or $10. And so the question is, how can you track that? How can you quantify that? And how can you make sure the right people understand that? That doesn't mean, thumping your chest and, always bragging, but it does mean that we need, as professionals, to start getting a little bit smarter and more thorough about tracking exactly what we're doing, what the accomplishments are, and being able to talk about that and present that when needed, and also in kind of casual things. I mean, I think in some ways this is what Elon Musk is getting at with this question of having people email, what did you do this week? I mean, that's a sort of ridiculously heavy-handed way of doing it. But it's also true that for us as individuals, it is a useful thing to say, what value did I contribute this week? And how can I just make sure that, a month from now, I might not even remember. But if I do write it down, then it enables me to go back and say, oh yeah, I actually am adding value to the company that I can show.
Yeah, it's like, it's journaling, right? But for your daily work. So I like that parallel as well. I think a lot of us just aren't consistent with it. I've got tons of notebooks where I have notes from all kinds of one-on-one meetings. And when it's time to actually pull them out, I'm like, I have no idea. So that's just for me. I'm also just thinking, like, to this advice that I saw, I don't know if you agree with it or not. If a person feels that they may be in danger of being laid off, are their instincts usually right?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I would say, it sounds wishy-washy, but it depends on the individual. If we're talking about tech, let's say, I think it is a well-known fact that in the world of tech, there is a wide range of people's innate ability to read situations and read other people's emotions. And some folks are not so good at that. So they just might not be the best barometer. But I do think that there are some people who are more perceptive. I mean, I say this, it's a good thing and a bad thing, right? Like a lot of people who've experienced trauma are really perceptive about reading other people's emotions, for good and for ill, right?
Uh-huh.
But certainly if you are someone who's like, you know what, if someone's acting different to me, if someone's not saying something, like I can feel it, I see it, I mean, they're probably not wrong. They've gotten really good for a variety of reasons, whether it's how they were born or experiences that have happened to them, at understanding these kind of micro movements, these sort of small tells that other people might not pick up on. And you may well be sniffing something in the air. It's possible.
On the same topic, if you do feel like you're in danger, should you be doing anything differently? Because I've also seen advice saying that you should just play it cool, don't change up too much, don't act like, you're too nervous and start acting up. Is that sound advice?
Well, I think that there's two levels on it. Certainly, it's probably never a good idea to be like acting up or whatever. I'm not sure, if layoffs are in the air, going to your boss and saying, tell me the truth,
right? Or okay, fine. There's that. But what if like, oh, I can do more? Just asking to be proactive.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, that would strike me as an effort to control the uncontrollable, because your effort that you're putting in this week is probably not going to change the structural decision about whether your department gets chopped or, whether your position does, because it's probably conversations that have been happening for months and months. So I don't think there's sort of an immediate thing. That being said, I think that we should always be aware, if you are working for someone else, we somehow magically pretend, it's like magical thinking, that it is a solid, steady paycheck. But, this is not France, right? There are not worker guarantees.
Whoa, throwing France under the bus here. All right. Okay.
Again, for good and for ill, workers are very well protected in France. And sometimes that means that it's hard to fire a terrible employee. It also means it's hard to fire a great employee. In the U.S., people can be let go much more easily. And as a result of that, we need to just constantly remind ourselves, because we might be lulled into a state of false complacency.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, certainly for me, this was very vivid. I was laid off unexpectedly from my first job that I ever had. I had no notice. They gave me 4 days worth of severance pay.
Wow.
So I had to figure things out quickly. But we need to recognize, things could happen fast. And so should you be preparing in a general way at all times for the possibility of losing your job? I think you should. However, the important thing, very important, make sure if you're messing around with your LinkedIn profile that the settings are turned off so that your boss is not notified that you're doing it. That is an important thing to mention.
Oh, yeah. Listen, we've all been there where we've noticed that employee, that coworker that has a new picture or has updated their current job description, those are all little tells, right?
That's for sure. That's for sure.
I love that you brought up job complacency and a false sense of security, because I think one of the other big trends that I've been watching, reporting on, is the rise in fractional jobs. And I'm wondering if you have seen any changes to maybe the clients that you're working with, or just even the conversations that you're having with your peers, that this is actually a more attractive option for some people at a certain level, because at least maybe they have more control, or is that also a false sense of control?
So fractional jobs is something that, of course, has been in the conversation for a long time. I think employees have always loved the idea because, there's lots of people who are like, wow, this is fun, but doing this 70 hours a week, less fun. Right. So, how can I have just a smaller piece of it that would be so much more satisfying? And of course, there's well-known reasons why it hasn't worked in a broad sense in general, which is, it's a little confusing with sort of the switching costs of two different people, and there's coordination where things can get a little murky. So it's just easier for businesses to have one person doing all of the things. That makes sense. That being said, again, going back to our through line here, Hope, if you have a strong enough brand and reputation in the marketplace, whether or not an employer prefers a certain way of doing things, if they are desperate enough for you, they will say, great, we can get you for 30 hours a week. We can get you for 20 hours a week. We will take it. And there's real power in that. So I think, I don't mean this in an adversarial sense, but I do mean that it's useful to be aware that there is always a power dynamic and a power balance between, labor and management, between employer and employee. And if you can get your relative power up in the marketplace, it means that your employer, basically, if they want what you can deliver, they sort of have to accept your terms, and that's very powerful.
Okay, I like that reality check a lot. I want to go back inside the company structure conversation just for a second, because one group of people who I empathize with a lot is this middle manager layer and level. They not only are workers themselves, they might not even have a lot of power and transparency into layoffs, into the inner workings of executive management and how they're thinking about costs, but they also still have to motivate, right, their direct reports. They still have to deliver. So they sit in this very tricky layer of the pie of the cake. What is your best advice for them? Because they, again, still have to drive to their own goals. They're measured upon those goals. If they don't perform, like, they're also on the chopping block potentially, but they're also managing their own mental health.
Yeah, it's a really difficult situation. I mean, it's sort of the managerial equivalent of like the sandwich generation, where you have to care for small children and elderly parents at the same time. Yes. It's like so many pressures all at once.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think the most important thing that we can have as a mantra is, if you are in that position where you have people turning to you and looking for answers and looking for support, you so desperately want to give it to them. And it feels almost like a failing of yours if you can't give them that definitive answer or that reassurance. And the problem, and I think what we have to accept, if you are in middle management, you don't have the answers. In fact, probably your bosses don't even have the answers, because they're responding in real time and trying to figure things out. They're tacking and going in different directions. And so it's a fool's errand for you to try to give certainty. I think the most important thing that we need to keep in mind is, say what you know, but be careful to draw the line and say, well, here's the part that we don't know. And as long as you're honest about that, it may not be as reassuring as your employees want, but they will understand and respect you for it. And the worst thing we can do in this situation is overpromise in one way or another.
I think that the tricky part sometimes when you're the direct report talking to your manager is that you kind of question maybe their loyalties, right? Like, are they looking out for the company? Are they looking out for you? Should we just dissuade ourselves of even having that level of skepticism around our managers?
I mean, I think that this is a situation where you probably need to think about your manager as an individual and what kind of a relationship you have with them. It is absolutely true that there are some people in middle management that are more upward oriented,
Yes.
and there are some that are more downward oriented in terms of who they feel that their constituency is. And it is hard. It's a hard line to balance. It's a very hard job to try to do both, to please both masters. But I think that the employee probably has to rely on their own sense of their relationship with their manager about, is this person shooting straight with me? Is this person actually looking out for my best interest, or are they just kind of parroting something to me? And you probably have too. I have worked for both kinds of managers, so
Yes.
you just have to feel it out.
Let's move outside of the structure of a company and talk more about the broader landscape, political landscape that is now seeping into all corners of life and work. The biggest change in tone and vibe and messaging the past couple of months has been this rollback of DEI policies. And there have been a lot of public statements from big corporations around their rollback of those policies. You've got other companies that are staying firm, that are fighting proxy battles to keep their DEI policies, in the case of Apple, for example. But then you also have workers, right, who are also now speaking out very publicly on LinkedIn about their own employers or just about their feelings on this. But what are some general guidelines around how workers should express their feelings around these big corporate decisions, these big political decisions?
We saw obviously in 2020 there was a swing one way dramatically on the pendulum, and now in 2025 we're seeing almost the exact opposite swing on the pendulum. And I think, like most things in life, it's not great to be at the extreme ends of one or another. We need to come back to a sort of more sensible middle. And so I think that, we saw examples where employees were so radicalized during 2020 about Black Lives Matter and other DEI causes that they were publicly criticizing, you could even argue insulting their employers. And I don't think that's appropriate. If I was an employer, I'd want to sack them too, because if you have someone who is being insubordinate to you, that creates a really bad precedent around any issue. Meanwhile, now we're in a really reactionary phase where something as innocuous as saying, you know what, we believe that it's a great thing to have different kinds of people work at our company. And all of a sudden it's like, oh no, that's terrible. And so I think that as long as we can, as best we can, speak our truths and be positive about our vision without critiquing, without going into a kind of ideological tailspin.
Yeah.
My hope is that we can restore some sense and semblance to the discussion, because it is important in a very heterogeneous nation to say, yes, we would like the talents of our nation in our workforce.
I think that there's still an attempt by many workers to maintain the control and say, well, I don't care that you're my employer and that you pay me a salary. I still feel like I should come first. Is that a folly, or is that something that you think will shift with the tide?
I mean, if you are someone who is either independently wealthy or you are an AI engineer, then great, be as radical as you want. But for almost everyone else, if you are expecting to get a paycheck, I think we need to recognize that the tide has definitely turned back. In fact, when we were having these conversations in 2021, early 2022 about quiet quitting and all of the other trends, I remember saying at the time, like, basically, kids, enjoy it while it lasts, because we are going to have reversion to the mean. And the mean is that the person who gives you money is always going to have more power in that equation, because they have the ability to say, okay, would you not like my money? Great. You do you. So I think that's where we're back to for sure.
Okay. So I think, a lot of us can get really fired up, right, with seeing social media influencers like post about these things and like kind of that outrage, but that's not the mean.
No, I mean, I think that smart corporations are always willing to hear a reasonable presentation of facts if there's something that is going on in your company, as a policy or what have you, when you are expressing it and you line it up and you submit it through the appropriate channels and not, in a TikTok video or something like that, I think in general, people want to listen to that. They may not agree with it. They may not do something about it, but they will respect the process. But, as with all things, it's not very satisfying because it doesn't feel like you're making a statement in the sort of performative way that, marching in the past or, doing a big thing on social media now might feel like. It's less gratifying, but it is an important method of communication.
Are you hearing kind of from your clients that they are also kind of reverting back to their means? If like 2 years ago, they were coming to you saying, Dorie, I'm like fired up and, I want to quit and like great resignation, blah, blah, blah. Like, are you hearing that shift in tone with the people that you're talking to, that you're working with?
There's not so much one thing that people are worked up about. It's kind of more of an overall sense of a tidal wave that they are trying to navigate. But what I would say is that because there is so much uncertainty, so many people are feeling unmoored, essentially, there are a lot of people that are at least wanting to think about a plan B.
Yes.
And the plan B is, what if I get laid off? Or the plan B is, the typical thing that we get, although I think it's heightened now, is like, what if I need to flee the country, et cetera, et cetera.
Do you advise people to start an entrepreneurial side journey while they're employed? Like, what else do you advise people to do proactively so that they can stay ahead of change?
Yeah, I'm the queen of Plan B here, Hope.
Yeah.
I always
and
love
reinvention.
Yes, and reinvention.
Yes.
That's right. I always like to have people have something in their back pocket, right? Because when we get too dependent on anything, if you're too dependent on your Wi-Fi and you don't have a hotspot, that becomes a disaster, right? Whereas if you have the hotspot ready, it's like, okay, well, that's a hassle, but I can manage. And so similarly, I want people to future-proof themselves enough so that if there is a disruption, it's always going to be annoying. It's always going to be, sort of a, oh, why do I have to do this? But it doesn't become devastating. So in fact, you are asking the right person, because I wrote my book, Entrepreneurial You.
Yes.
And then this is about how to create multiple streams of income. So yes, I'm a big believer. Now, of course, you have to be cognizant of your company's policies. You can't, sort of do literally the same thing that your company does, because they will look askance. But creating some kind of a entrepreneurial sideline, I think, is very valuable for everyone, even if you work inside of a corporation, because it gives you at worst, it is a non-lucrative way that you are building connections and building skills and experience and trying new things. At best, it is a real source of revenue and something that you can fall back on whenever you wish.
I love that. As we wrap up here, I just want to touch really quickly on the generational divide. I hear from a lot of companies that they are looking at a worker shortage, that there's a lack of interest in, their profession, let's say. And then, on that other side, it's because the, younger workers are looking at alternative career paths, looking at content as a business. How sustainable, if you are talking to a young person today, how sustainable is that sort of mindset? Do you think that they should ultimately prepare themselves for a traditional job or two?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I now have been around the block long enough that I've heard very similar things. 20 plus years ago, it was, oh no, Gen X, they're so lazy, they're slackers. It's just reality bites again and again. And, and then Gen Y were, wringing our hands about it. Largely, I think that this is a function of life stages. My wife actually is a researcher on the study of higher education. And she did a really interesting study where she was comparing college students of today to college students from 1975. And with the interviews that they did, literally it's almost indistinguishable. You add in, instead of, oh, I saw this on Instagram, you say, oh, I got a phone call or something. But if you leave aside the exact tech platform, the experiences they had, the feelings they had, the things that they did or that they were concerned about, basically almost exactly the same thing. So I think the short version is that when you're 22 and you're not married, there's certain things you want and certain things you're interested in and you're not interested in. By the time you get to be 35 and you have kids and you have a mortgage, you know what you're interested in? You're interested in earning money. So I think that this is just a cyclical life stage thing and not necessarily a huge generational arc.
But you don't think the technology aspect of this and the scale of platforms contributes to a different version of this? Only I ask that only because I try to befriend young people because I am getting up there myself and going like, oh my gosh, I'm disconnected from what's happening. But they're telling me like I don't even have a chance hope of getting a mortgage. So like I'm just in this job and I don't even see a pathway. They just think they're on this treadmill and that they'll never even get to a point where they can have those dreams and goals.
I mean, you're pointing to something important. It is absolutely true that there has been economic stagnation over the past 40 years and that, housing prices, for instance, have continued to go up. So it becomes much harder for people to, sort of get in and get that starter home. So I think that absolutely is true. But I do think that ultimately it's sort of a balancing act, right? I mean, everybody when they're young thinks that they can win the lottery, essentially, which is, whether that lottery is I'm going to be a basketball player, I'm going to be an influencer, I'm going to, whatever. And some do. The ones that don't are, if they play the game well, they can leverage those skills in other really productive things. Like, okay, you tried to be an influencer, you didn't get 10 million followers, you can still work in-house for a brand and you'll have really fantastic content creation skills and can be a social media manager and can get a nice 6-figure job out of it. So I think a lot of it is about pivoting and figuring out how those skills can become transferable.
Last 2 questions here. Where in the economy is safest from job cuts? Like if you were looking at starting your side hustle or creating a second stream of income, where do you think people should look to turn to?
Manual labor all the way, Hope. It's the new plastics. Oh my God.
The new plastics.
Yeah. Everybody used to think that robots were coming for the truck drivers, and instead they came for the marketing directors. And I think, as I am living here in Miami and dealing with mishigas from contractors and trying to get plumbers and trying to get electricians and all of these things, it turns out that at present is what is hardest for technology and automation to do. And so I think those are really strong plays. Oh my goodness, if I had a PE fund, I would just be snapping those puppies up.
That actually is happening. I mean, look, to your point about like value, like in the moment when your sink is overflowing, whatever the plumber says it's going to cost, you're going to pay like in that moment. And last question for you, personal one. What are you doing to keep sane, to stay grounded during times of so much, turmoil and uncertainty?
Yes. Well, aside from saving a lot and hoarding money, I've become a big fan of saunas. I even have a sauna blanket now as well. It's the ability for cardiac benefits as well as muscle recovery and stress reduction are actually shockingly well documented. There are so many health claims where it's hard to pin down, but because saunas are such a big thing in Finland, they have been researched extensively, and it is truly remarkable how effective they are for cardiac health.
What do you experience, and how long have you been doing this? When do you do it? I want to know.
All the facts.
Yeah.
It turns out that according to research, the sort of optimal dose for saunas is at least 4 times a week and for at least 20 minutes. So somewhere in the sort of 20 to 30 minute range. So I probably don't hit that every week, but I strive to do it as often as possible. Typically, I'll do it after a workout because you can do it at any time. But if you do it after a workout, the research has said that it is useful for muscle recovery, and so you're less likely to be sore after the workout if you have the heat penetrating. So,
and then you can work out more, and so it's like a virtuous cycle.
That's right. And because you're kind of already sweaty from the workout, and then you get even more sweaty from the sauna, then you don't have to double up on the showers.
What are you doing? You're listening to a podcast? Like, are you like on a mom? I haven't seen one of these. I got to look it up.
So, if I'm in the like a sauna, I will typically bring in a paperback book with me and just use it as like old school time, because you can't play with your phone. That's a crucial thing, because it's like,
wait, are you in the one that's like where you lie down, or are you in the one that's like you're standing up? And I see people at Target in this ad, they're like reading a book.
So that's very funny. So for the sauna blanket in particular, I am in the one where you're lying down. And so usually I'm doing a podcast for that one.
I love it. Now, hopefully it could be this podcast in the future.
That's
Dorie,
right.
It was so great to chat with you. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that's been on your mind that you want to just say, or anything else you want to promote?
I want to know how you're de-stressing, Hope. What are you doing? What's your tip?
I'm awful at it. I don't have any tips. I'm a stress eater. I stay up way too late. This is why I do this. I mean, I'm getting free advice. Like, I'm getting hundreds and thousands of dollars worth of advice right now. No, I'm trying to walk every day, a few miles. Exercising was a big part of my life, and then the pandemic hit, and so at least I'm trying to be consistent with that. And I do like my long walks. So that's one thing. Yeah. Well, Dorie, thank you again for being on. I really appreciate it. I hope we get to chat again soon. I'll see you next time.
Thank you, Hope. Great to talk with you.
Thanks.